Open up! It's time for the pill!
Barnacles, I hate the pill.
Most of you watching this video right now have probably seen me make videos titled similarly to this one, so I bet you know what I'm about to say for those who aren't familiar with me or my channel. I'm a full-time atheist activist who is very involved with the atheist community, both in person and online. I care a great deal about the quality of discourse between atheists in my community, as well as discourse between atheists and those outside of my community. Because of this, I try to be responsible with my words and influence in the hope of creating an atheist community which is constantly learning and improving. Sometimes that means that I feel the need to push back against certain things I've heard other atheists say. So the goal of this video is to improve the discourse we're all a part of. In no way do I mean to say that all or even most atheists say the things I'm about to push back on. If you don't say these things, I'm not talking about you, and if you do, I'm not demanding that you hang on my every word. You're not my disciple, and I'm not your prophet. You shouldn't just believe everything that I say, and I'm not asking you to. I only ask that you consider what I have to say, then do your best to work out its truth value. Let's, from all sides, try to have a productive conversation. We're all born atheists until someone starts lying to us. I decided to put this one first because I want to make the spirit of this video very clear. Some people who are close friends of mine have said or still say this. We've debated over it, and while some have come to agree with me, some haven't. Still, though, we're friends because we try to take well-meaning constructive criticism as it's often intended, as a sign of great care, not malice. So here's my take on this. While it's true that we don't have a belief in God as babies, it describes no more about the psychological state of a baby to say that they're an atheist than it says about the psychological state of an animal, or even an inanimate object. Babies aren't capable of comprehending or even having a position on God belief, so even though we often define atheism as lacking a belief in God, saying that babies are atheists effectively communicates nothing about atheism or the psychological state of babies. This phrase also suggests that humans are naturally atheistic, that a people or culture must always be introduced to a God concept from the outside in order to entertain one. However, archaeology and anthropology show us that belief in gods across cultures and across time is probably even more common than written language, which suggests that God belief is natural and even nearly inherent to human psychology. It doesn't convey the right message to say that everyone is born an atheist when we know that humans have a natural inclination to believe in some sort of god or gods. I wouldn't say that people are born theists either, but I would say that people typically have more of a natural inclination toward theism than toward atheism. Lastly, this phrase implies that teaching a God belief to a child is equivalent to lying. This implies that those who teach God belief are themselves unconvinced of what they're teaching, or that they know that they're teaching falsehoods. This idea assumes the beliefs of those who teach God belief rather than taking into account the reasons theists actually give for their positions. If we don't want theists assuming things about us, let's not assume things about them. If theists really do believe that God is real, and I posit that it's an unfounded assumption to say that they don't, then theists are not lying to children when they teach them a God belief. This phrase does not communicate a valuable message, it implies a few things that are false, it makes unwarranted assumptions about the beliefs of those different from ourselves, and it unfairly smears their moral character. This is not a phrase I'd recommend using in any conversation. Reading the Bible will make you an atheist. There are several variations of this phrase out there. Some will say things like, if I were to recommend one book to make you an atheist, it would have to be the Bible. While others have turned it into a kind of meme by saying something like, believe the Bible without reading it and you're a Catholic. Only read and believe the parts that you like and you're an evangelical. Read it cover to cover and you'll be an atheist. I know what a lot of atheists are getting at with this. Plenty of Christians say that they believe in and base their lives on the Bible without actually having a lot of knowledge about it. That's understandably frustrating to atheists and to a lot of better educated Christians, but I still don't think saying this is a good way to deal with that issue. First off, it implies that the only idea of God to consider in becoming an atheist is the Christian one. There are countless conceptions of gods to consider if you're actually interested in exploring the question of God's existence. Now, I can't ask anyone to wrestle with every conceivable idea of a god before taking a position. What I'm asking is that we not encourage religious illiteracy with our bolstering of atheism. If you say that you don't believe in any gods, but when asked you make it clear that you've only ever considered belief in a single god, I'm going to think you haven't really thought through your position much. By saying that just reading the Bible will make you an atheist, you're implying that you think the only concept for an atheist to contend with is the Christian God. That rightly appears very ignorant to non-Christian theists. This phrase also implies that most, if not all, people who read the entire Bible become atheists, and that's an unjustified assertion. There are countless people who have read the entire Bible and are still theists. I had read the entire Bible multiple times over by my late teens, and I studied it deeply both personally and in college classes when I was a Christian. Reading it more didn't push me more toward atheism. Apologists whose job it is to study the Bible and convince people of its worth probably hear atheists saying this and pity the ignorance it portrays. After all, they've obviously read the Bible through multiple times and they still believe, so you must not understand it. This phrase attempts to point out ignorance and hypocrisy, but it encourages religious illiteracy, implies that which is false, and either indicates or gives the appearance of ignorance. I would stay away from it. You can't be reasoned out of something you weren't reasoned into. There are two things I want to address here. The first is this specific phrase. The second, which I'll come back to, is the idea that religious people have little capacity for reason or logic. So first, the idea that you can't use reason to discard a belief if you didn't use reason to gain it is demonstrably false. The religious backgrounds of many figures in the atheist community should exemplify that to you. People leave their unreasonable beliefs for more reasonable ones all the time. I'm sure most people watching this video can think of a time when they held a belief which they weren't reasoned into, and can explain why reason brought them out of that belief. I also think there are people in existence who believe in religious ideas because they were reasoned into them, that believe them because they want to believe whatever is true, and they have found certain religious ideas to be reasonable. As I'm sure you guys know, I personally tend to think that in many cases, if someone believes religious ideas purely based on reason, they probably don't have access to enough information to counter those ideas. But because I know most people exist in a different environment to myself with different levels of access to information, whether more or less, I think it's possible to believe in a great deal of religious ideas while being as reasonable as one is able to be. To illustrate my point, if I died right now and found out there really is a God, I'd maintain that my lack of belief in God was reasonable during my life. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't sufficient evidence to conclude that God exists. There very well could be information that proves God's existence out there, but since I don't have it and can't find it despite my best efforts, it's reasonable for me not to hold a belief in God right now. Likewise, if a person has tried their best to work out the existence of God reasonably, but they have different information than I do, so they conclude that God does exist, they're not necessarily being unreasonable even if they're incorrect. They're just reasonably concluding what the information they have points them to. All that said, the fact that someone is religious does not always mean that they weren't reasoned into their beliefs. Now on to address an implication often carried by sayings like this, that religious people are incapable of using reason or logic. When people use reason to work through a problem, we don't automatically compare the reasoning we just used with the thought processes we've used to work through all other problems. Our brains compartmentalize things. We can use faulty reasoning in some areas of our lives while still being reasonable about other things. You can believe certain irrational religious ideas while still being rational otherwise. I'd argue that asserting that religious people aren't capable of reason is bigoted. This idea is not based on fact, and it's often stated in order to disparage people different from the person speaking. That's harmful to others and makes the speaker, and often by extension other atheists like me, look hateful and ignorant. To recap, the statement I've addressed is demonstrably false, it often carries an implication which is unfounded, and that implication is often used to unfairly and tribalistically disparage others. I stand firmly against its use. Atheism and atheists are honest, rational, and reasonable. I'm not discussing any particular phrase or saying here, but more of an idea that I've seen some atheists bolster, especially when comparing their group to religious ones. That idea is that atheism is inherently rational or honest, or that atheists are inherently rational or honest people because they've come to a valid conclusion. I think that atheism can be a consequence of honest, rational inquiry into life's biggest questions, but it isn't necessarily honest or necessarily rational. You can be an atheist for bad reasons. You could think all concepts of God are just different bearded men in the sky, not believe in those men in the sky, and then call yourself an atheist regarding all concepts of God. You could be an atheist because you blindly accept what your parents or even the state taught you. Those are bad reasons for being an atheist, which really have nothing to do with honest, rational inquiry. Also, until there's reliable evidence that demonstrates that atheists are somehow inherently more rational and less prone to bias than theists, there isn't any good reason to conclude that atheists are psychologically any different than theists in that regard. We shouldn't imply that atheists are more rational, reasonable, logical, or honest than theists, because as far as evidence suggests, we can be just as unreasonable, biased, and dishonest as any theist. Look, I know how much loyalty to logic and reason, how much intellectual honesty and emotional control stepping out of faith and becoming atheist can take. I've gone through that, and it was intense. Still, though, those experiences of ours don't justify any generalizations about atheism or atheists. Thinking that you and your group are exceptionally, inherently rational is actually pretty dangerous. If you think you're less error-prone than others, you're not going to second-guess yourself when you should. Ironically, thinking this can make you much more error-prone. From time to time, I see an atheist online insist that they're right long after they've been proven wrong about something, and they justify themselves by waxing poetic about how rational, honest, logical, and brave it is to be an atheist. Theists who see that kind of rhetoric and think atheists like that are absurd and not worth listening to are right. My concern is that theists might see enough people like that online or in person to get the idea that most atheists are self-aggrandizing blowhards. I don't want that, and most atheists, especially you guys watching this video, probably don't want that either. So be careful how you describe yourself, your group, and its ideas. The last time I made a video like this, I lost several hundred subscribers, and I even got a few pretty hateful personal messages saying that I had regressed to my former Christian fundamentalism, whatever that means, or that I was stroking my ego by preaching my superiority, making me no better than a corrupt priest. I hope that most of you can see, though, that these videos of mine are just meant to highlight the need for nuance, restraint, and empathy in the complex discussions in which us atheists often find ourselves. There are a lot of things to love about the atheist community, but always remember that our group doesn't deserve any less scrutiny just because it's ours. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. As always, go ahead and subscribe, check out my Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at GM Skeptic, join my Discord, and until next time, stay skeptical.